never know just how much of the picture is going to be cut off in the video, so I wanted to move the caption at the top. If Newton was a botanist, down a bit. So this is the same, I'm recording this the same day I recorded the first part of the chapter. Hopefully my brain is not as squirrely now as it was. But we're going to continue with the more advanced, the later evolving groups of plants. Big development. That when you think about it, is taking bits and pieces that were already evolved and combining them in a very useful way. Pollen. Pollen is a casing to allow sperm to be transferred somewhere, some way other than water. So, what's a spore? Well, a spore is a casing to allow a little reproductive structure, asexually produced reproductive structure, to transfer through the air. So pollen can build on that. Pollen is basically a spore casing around something that's not a spore. The female part of the later plants winds up being integrated into some part of the plant. And the pollen can get onto the surface, but how does the sperm get into where the actual egg cell is? That's a second ability. That's the ability to build tubes, right? Is that the fern group are considered the first vascular plants, the first good tube stem leaves plants, right? No stems or leaves in the bryophytes. But the tracheophytes can build tubes. So now you figure, okay, the pollen's just got to get to the part of the flower that's right there, and then it's just does its business there. No, it's got to get into where the egg cells are, and for that it needs to basically build a tunnel. And so the casing of pollen also has the genetics to extend a tube, a pollen tube, down to where the egg cell is going to be. But those were both abilities that were kind of in there already and could be combined, and because a lot of ways that's what evolution does. It's the same thing that we do when we build stuff, is we take things that already exist and kind of put them together in kind of new and innovative ways. I know that kind of makes it sound like intelligent design, but people stumble on stuff too. It's random, sometimes even in us. So we're going to start with the gymnosperms. So this is the first group where pollen is a way to reproduce sexually. And it frees the plants from having to be in circumstances with open water, surface water, for the sperm to swim, and also for the male and the female parts to be really close to one another. Gymnosperms include a number of groups. We tend to think of the ones that we can see around here, the pines and the spruces and the evergreens, basically. Cones is a very common gametophyte in gymnosperms. And of course, think of a pine tree. The cones are part of the tree. The tree is considered a sporophyte. Again, don't ask me why. For the most part, it's not doing any type of actual reproduction. but they consider it a sporophyte. And the cones of pine trees, very often you can tell the difference, is that the male cones are little and they're produced way up at the top of the tree. The female tree cones are bigger and they tend to grow farther down on the tree. Why? Well, the males, the cones are producing pollen, which is not big, even if you're cranking out lots and lots and lots of it. So you don't need a big structure to produce a lot of pollen. Now, in the case of the trees around here, the pollen spreads through the air, and that's very typical for gymnosperms, is that they typically are air spread pollen and air spread seeds. And of course, if you're going to spread through the air, the farther off the ground you can put things into the air, the farther it's going to spread. And if you're going to catch the pollen, the female cones have to catch the pollen, then farther down is not a bad thing. And they're bigger because they have to produce the seeds, and there's much more of an investment in food and size in the seeds. So this group, you do have, everything has vascular systems in it. The leaves do, the stems do, and the roots do. So we don't have rhizoids or rhizomes anymore. We have, honest to goodness, roots. Very typical in this group, the leaves are long and narrow and often have a cuticle on them, are fairly waterproofed, and so they're needles. Why? Well, a lot of successful gymnosperms that are still competing with the angiosperms, the later group, are competing in areas of where it gets cold and it snows. Now the angiosperms, in order to keep the snow from breaking their branches, they drop their leaves off because big flat leaves catch a lot of snow. Needles, not so much. Needles, little bit of wind, snow doesn't really accumulate. Is that around here, you will see snow break pine branches when it's really big, really sticky flakes, and we get a lot of it all at once. And then it can kind of accumulate almost as clumps on the branches of pine trees. And that's pretty much the only time you see it break the branches of the pine trees. Typically, needles are pretty good at living in a snowy condition. And so they don't need to be making leaves every season, every new spring. So they can just generate the needles and be fine. They're also very good at existing in drier conditions. The cuticle casing is good at resisting water loss. Now, the stems are very often woody. What does that mean? It means that they're brown, which means they're not photosynthetic, and they're tough, fairly thick. And another thing about woody stems is the phloem is on the outside, usually the underside of the bark, and the xylem is added layer by layer by layer, growing outward from the middle. And we'll come back to this and talk about tree rings because it's something we tend to think more of for angiosperms as well. But both gymnosperms and angiosperms, if it's the right kind of angiosperm, produce seasonal rings of xylem. And typically the only xylem that's active is the one that's close to the core. I'm sorry, the one that's close to the bark. I'm still saying things wrong. The outer layers, which is often true why a lot of very, very old trees can completely hollow out in the middle, and it doesn't really do much, it doesn't damage them. Is that it turns out a hollow cylinder and a solid cylinder, not that much difference in support strength. And if the xylem is going up the outside, then the middle being hollowed out. It's still, there's food and water going up from the roots to the top anyway. And the phloem comes down through the bark, which is why if you strip the bark all the way off of a tree, you're cutting the nutrition off from the roots. It'll take a while to kill the tree, but it'll do it. So as I said before, I'm just writing it down. Pollen is released from the male gametophytes, lands on the female gametophytes, typically male cones and female cones, but that's not always true in gymnosperms. And the sperm are gonna migrate down this tube. It takes a while. A typical pine tree, it may take 1.5 years to get that pollen tube from the surface down to where the egg cells are. So the sperm have to be able to live a really long time and be able to resist shifts in temperature and all sorts of other things. But eventually, the sperm meets the eggs. They grow into an embryo in a casing, very often with a little wing on it. And the seeds are released into the air. And if the seed lands someplace where it's possible, they will germinate and grow into a new plant. Is that you need the right conditions for the seed to be. The seed's not always going to land someplace good, but when they do, and this is typical for gymnosperms and for the later group angiosperms. And I think what I'm going to do is split this up, because the angiosperms are going to be a long chapter anyway, or a long part of the chapter anyway. And if I can fit them onto a video all on their own, that would be good. So I'm going to cut this off with the gymnosperms.